With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. As always, we appreciate you being with us here on the program and choosing to make us a part of your day here at News Radio 1440 in the Situation Room. We love having you. We love that you're here, and we know that the reason that you're here is because we bring you all the latest local news, and today, of course, is no exception, as we have been doing for some time now. We start out the day with our Alabama coronavirus update. So let's go ahead and look. Big day, by the way, for the Tri-County area, the river region. Montgomery County now has surpassed 200 confirmed cases. So that's still a pretty tiny minority of the overall cases, but Montgomery County, who thus far has, and this is still true, but has been one of the more mild areas when it comes to how hard each area of the state has been hit by this particular virus, despite having the very first case of, at least the very first confirmed case of coronavirus, COVID-19 in the state of Alabama. We do indeed have one of the lower rates compared to the other major cities, the other three major cities in the state. But we'll go ahead and take a look at the update for today from the Alabama Department of Public Health. So you can see there are now 4,379 confirmed cases, and we have over 36,000 tested. 82 have died from this particular illness, which is the increase from yesterday to today is up a little bit. And then statewide, 553 cases have been hospitalized that have been confirmed with COVID-19. So that is Alabama by the numbers. Now, one thing that I think that it is important to point out for context is we are doing substantially better than pretty much every early model, every early predictor thought that the state of Alabama was going to do, and that is a trend that is continuing. It is one that remains to be true nationally. We have seen that on the national scale, that all of the models that were predicting basically apocalyptic levels of overexposure to the virus, way too many cases, the overflowing of our hospital and our hospitals and our resources medically overall has not happened. And I think that's a combination of things, because remember that a lot of those original models, they did predict with some type of mitigation, some type of social distancing, taking it to the extremes of staying home, at least the majority of people that are non-essential staying home. So when a lot of people say, well, the reason that these models didn't come to pass is because we did all the things that they were predicting, that's not entirely true. Because there were some models that came out early that we took a look at, and they were predicting basically zero mitigation. We don't do anything. We leave everything open. If that happens, millions of people die. And that's part of the reason that when we looked at the other models and compared them to the ones that predicted doing some levels of social distancing and mitigation, and we looked and saw that the death rates there were still really bad, but not nearly as bad as the ones that we were talking about, we decided to go with those. And since then, those tend to have been the models that people are trotting out. Not the ones that showed no social distancing, the ones that already included their predictions of what social distancing would do into the equation, and Alabama is no exception in all of that. So when people say, well, the only reason that the predictions were way off is because we actually did the things that the predictions were not counting for, that's not really true. Now, I want to be very clear here before people start getting the wrong idea. I am not saying that because the models were bad, that there was any malicious intent by the scientists. I think that they really were looking at the data available to them and predicting what they were. I think there were some models that they really should have known better. There was one that was widely touted and even used to put a lot of the policies in place that we wound up putting in place by, I want to say it was the University of Washington State. And I believe that one was not only wildly incorrect, but they actually seemed to show some real problems with their methodology in arriving at those predictions. But overall, I think that these were not things that were made in bad faith. I also don't think that for the most part, I'm not saying that there was none of this going on because I can't prove this. For the most part, I think most of these models were made in the best of faith, not trying to get some kind of political end out of it. But I think that that played a factor in it, and if you look, some of the most dramatic models, some of the ones that were the scariest, and some of the ones that were saying, well, if we don't do this, then we're going to have, large swaths of the American people dying, there actually was some politically motivated money backing those. And I'm not just talking about one side, I'm talking about foreign influence and all kinds of other things. So, not really going to get into that because that's beyond the scope of what I want to talk about today, but the point is, some of the models is just writing off the fact that they didn't come true by, well, they didn't account for the fact that we would actually do a lot of those things. That's not true. You have to do that on a case-by-case basis and look at whether the model did predict, okay, this is going to be what happens with some mitigation, moderate mitigation, severe mitigation. Even those ones have turned out to be wildly inaccurate for the most part, which I think there are a number of different factors that could account for that. But ultimately, what we're looking at here and what we're looking at in the state of Alabama is that the models were largely wrong, which is something that I think even the people who put these models together would be incredibly grateful to hear if they're just normal, rational people. But a lot of the cases that we're looking at, if you look at this graph, you can see that there is a increase, and it's not one, when you're looking at the cases in Alabama, it is not a drastic increase. In fact, that increase is smaller than the increase that we saw from yesterday, but it is still one that is substantial enough that it breaks that seeming plateau that we were talking about a couple days ago. It seemed as though, and you can see that for about up until yesterday, if you're looking at about the 10th through the 14th, it seems as though we were getting a leveling effect. We were seeming to plateau, and we were going to see us start to flatline, and then that was sort of what we were predicting. But that has not taken place because that trend, that pattern, has been broken. So while yesterday was a little bit worse than today is, not by much, they were pretty much the same, the point is that pattern has very clearly been broken. And when you look at that, it's not a spike. It's not a spike, but it's definitely not a plateau either. And so even though I was saying the other day it looks as though maybe Alabama started to level off, that just has shown to not be the case. And if you want to know how frustrating looking at this data is and trying to get something out of it, because I mean that's my job anyway. It's not just to bring you information, but to give you what my take on it is and sort of help you kind of navigate and get a richer understanding of the information. But if you'll go ahead and look at this graph, this is the new cases in Alabama, which you'll remember a few days ago we were talking about it going from an upward trend to a dip and then to a downward trend. Now, because of the past 2 days, that trend has been thrown wildly off course to where this data is basically useless. I mean, I'm not saying that it isn't useful in any way, and that's not to say that the same data in retrospect later couldn't be useful to tell us something. But ultimately, right now, there's really no decent conclusion or even decent prediction, even if you weren't reaching an actual conclusion, you were just kind of guessing at what would happen, that can be reached from this data. And so that's part of the reason that the past couple of days have really been difficult on people that are trying to sort of read the tea leaves and figure out what is next for the state of Alabama, because the data is just so far over the place that it doesn't really help us either predict what is going to happen or get a real understanding of why what is happening with the confirmed cases is happening. There's not really a link up with how the data goes with other things like testing. You can't really look at the testing and draw a conclusion based on the data that I've seen and that I've been collecting. So there's really nothing that you can connect it to. When data is that sporadic, usually it can only be useful if that sporadic data links up with some other kind of piece of data that you can help one event explain the other, but that's not even happening here. So not only is it sporadic and it's basically useless when looked at in a vacuum, we don't really have any data that would help us understand why exactly the rates and the new cases per day are going up and down and seem to have no pattern. So until somebody could find something that matches up with that, it's effectively useless data. And I get that that's frustrating. Like I've said so many times since this whole epidemic started, I understand. We all want answers. The unknown is one of the most irritating things that we can deal with. And guys, it's April 16th. It's April 16th, which means we're only halfway through the month of April, and we've got about another couple weeks to go before we get to May, when everything's supposed to get pretty close to opening back up and returning life to normal. So I understand the frustration. I really do. I'm in the middle of it myself. I'm really hoping that I can find some answers. I spend a pretty significant chunk of my day trying to figure out what those answers are, but right now, there's just not really anything that shows that that is the case. Now, the Trump administration and people inside the executive branch nationally have been talking about, and even some officials in the state of Alabama have been talking about, the idea that we have already peaked. Right now, the data doesn't bear that out. Maybe it will soon. I really hope that it does soon, but there's no discernible pattern based on what we can look at right now, other than it's going to continue to increase. It seems like at this point, a gigantic spike is unlikely, but that's about the closest thing to a prediction that I can give you as far as where this thing is going to go. I think it will continue to increase numerically, not exponentially, not seeing giant rates where we're doubling or tripling our rates from before. I think that it's going to continue to climb numerically and then start to level off. That seems to be the pattern that it has been following at least the past few days. So there's a couple stories around the state of Alabama that specifically deal with this. One is that there is a barbershop in Birmingham called the Mailroom, which, by the way, I love the name, the Mailroom. That's fantastic. It's of course mail spelt M-A-L-E. So the Mailroom. And I think really, I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but I think the reason that you've seen in recent years an increased popularity in barbershops that have been specifically geared towards men is because, at least in certain communities, it was probably less true in the South, but overall, there used to be something very masculine about going to the barbershop, and you had a very clear distinction between a ladies' beauty salon and a male barbershop. And I think men got really tired of having those two things combined to where they were basically walking into a place designed by women for women to get a haircut. And I think the reason that the popularity of places like Sports Clips, the Mailroom, there was Sportsman Barbershop in Auburn, which unfortunately is out of business now, no longer there, which was a shame because it was by far my favorite place to go. The reason you're seeing increases in those particular places is because men really felt like they were not being served or catered to, and they were going there because they basically didn't have any other choice. There's a whole bunch of chains and a whole bunch of other barbershops that were basically not really male barbershops. They were just beauty salons, and then you could get your hair cut as a man in them, but they weren't really catering to them, and that's why I think you've seen an increase in places like the Mailroom that have done presumably very, very well by doing that, which, by the way, all goes back to the fact that men and women are different. They have different likes, they have different wants, and you can cater to one or the other, especially in something that, like getting your hair done, hairstyles. So the fact that there are places like this where a guy can just go in, it's a male environment where you can go ahead and get your haircut and then walk out. Like that's something that very much appeals to men, and something that I think that we've been missing for a while. Now, this particular barbershop there in Birmingham, the owner, who decided to defy the stay-at-home orders and open up his shop despite the fact that it is not a essential business, which, frankly, pretty much any time this happens, whenever the government thinks that they can decide what you do and don't need, that's a pretty bad idea. Granted, nothing like this has happened in Alabama yet, but there have been several states where they've actually banned things like if you're going to Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that, they're banning the sale of things like lawn equipment, seeds that you could grow to, presumably feed your family if something goes south and the grocery stores can't open up for a while. And it's so ridiculous to me that the government believes that they can decide what people need better than the marketplace can. And that's one of the things that I thought made America as a country different, that the government doesn't get to decide those things, that you decide it. The customer gets to choose. And there will be some people that make good decisions, some people that will make bad decisions, but regardless, if the government isn't involved, then that allows more liberty to the person, and they are less likely to keep a good person, a well-intended purpose, or a well-intentioned person with a good purpose from getting something that they legitimately do need for what most people would deem as good reasons. It will keep that from happening. It may open up the door to bad decisions, but it also leaves the door open to people making good, responsible decisions, like planting a vegetable garden to take care of your family. Or even if you didn't need that, just the fact that you wanted it. I mean, you're at home, you've got nothing to do. Why not get some yard work done? that just makes sense to me. But anyway, beside all of that, with this particular barbershop, the owner, Scott Farr, said on an interview with Talk 99.5, which is one of our Cumulus sister stations up in Birmingham, he was on with Matt Murphy. And essentially, the criteria for me was no more complicated than I've got finite resources remaining, and I've got ongoing expenses. So it's a simple math calculation to tell me how many days I've got left before I shutter the doors for good. And there are a lot of people that depend on businesses for their livelihood. That's really all it is. It's no more complicated than that. One thing that is important to understand about what he's saying there, and I don't claim to be an expert in this field, I just know the little bit that I've picked up from people that were in this business. Though there are some barbershops where you are actually an employee of the company and you work for the company and you work by the hour, that typically is not the way that it works for most barbershops, whether you're talking about a big national chain or even your local store. Usually what happens is the barbershop provides the facility, the barbershop provides the chair, and you rent the chair. So you can go in and you can basically rent that space from the barbershop if you are a licensed barber. And then from that point on, that's when you go out and that's when you actually have business through commission like that. So that tends to be the business model, as it were, for that particular business plan. And because of that, and because these barbers are typically paid by commission, what do you think that means for what they're able to do now? Well, it stands to reason if they're not cutting hair, they're not making money. And so you have to keep in mind that the idea of closing a business, whether it was the right call or wrong call, I'm not trying to get into that now. I'm just saying that there are external considerations to that, because it's not just this guy, because they always want to paint, and I've seen this countless times since this whole coronavirus pandemic started, is that the second that somebody is suggesting to open a business, and they've done it with this guy too in the comment section on different social media sites, they're like, oh, he doesn't care about people, he just wants people to die. Well, no. This guy, whether he's making the right decision or not, and I tend to lean more towards the side of not, what this guy is doing is he's looking at his employees are in communication with him saying, boss, can we go in there? My family's, getting to the point to where we're going to need some income pretty soon. And, with barbers, there's probably at least one or two single moms that are in there. And so this guy is not only worried about himself, and it's not as though the owner of the company is some evil fat cat that just the only reason he wants to open up money or open up his business is because he wants to swim in giant piles of money that he thinks he's going to make being open during this time, which it's probably true that he's going to make less than he normally would, just because fewer people are going to be willing to go in to get a haircut. But nonetheless, regardless of that, it seems like everybody that is against this wants to paint this picture of a giant corporation that is only opening so that it can line its pockets, and they don't care about people that may get sick or die along the way. All this guy is saying is, look, it's not that. It's not that I'm not concerned about that, but I also need to be able to keep my business open, not only for my sake, but for my employees. I've got ongoing expenditures, and if I don't open soon, then my business is going to cease to exist. And so this guy is doing what probably millions of other Americans are contemplating doing at this point because of how long this has gone on. We've got to do something to open up the economy back. And that's another thing that is really important to understand. When somebody suggests that somebody that is saying we should go ahead and open up businesses and not stand in their way, the stay-at-home orders themselves should be rescinded or taken back, they're automatically accused of just not caring enough, which is the same lame argument that people use when you suggest, for example, that you remove all scary-looking guns because some idiot shot up a school, and you bring up, well, first of all, we have a right to those things, and second of all, and more importantly, I don't disagree that we should try to do everything we can to stop school shootings. I'm just saying this isn't the way to handle it, and there are other considerations in play. But then you're automatically labeled somebody that hates children and wants them to die because the person can't get past that initial, I don't even know what to call it, but that initial feeling that you just don't care enough. It's the same argument, really. It's different in the sense that what you're talking about is different, and you're not guaranteed a right, for example, to cut hair, but underlying it is the same logical fallacy. That anybody that sees the solution differently than you, it must be because they just don't care enough. Well, no, there's 1,000 different reasons why they may see it different than you, and one of them may be that they don't care enough. That may be part of it. But you shouldn't assume that they have an evil motive just because they see the solution differently than you. That's something that's very difficult to do, but I try to do it in my own life. I try to teach other people to do it as well. And another thing, too, that you should understand from that quote that he just said, this was not a decision that was made lightly. You may remember, and I won't get into the whole thing again, you may remember yesterday what I was talking about with risk versus reward, that this thing is going to end, this shutdown is going to end, not when the government says that it's going to end, but when people feel as though the risk that they are taking is less than the reward. So if you've got risk over here, reward over here, right now people generally feel like the risk, dying, is significantly higher than the reward, which would be making spending money. But all of a sudden, when making spending money becomes making grocery money or being able to survive, that reward gets a lot higher than it was before. And as this thing goes on, you also have to consider that the level of risk is starting to dip. When they start feeling like, okay, there's a treatment out there for it now, and there are some people dying, but the odds of me dying are pretty low, that's going to start to dip. If we get a vaccine, that's going to dip a lot. And so what we're doing here is we're managing these two levels, and all of a sudden, once risk starts to dip below where people feel the reward is, then people are going to start going out again, regardless of what the government says. This is a guy that has gotten there. I don't think most people are there yet, but that's where this guy is standing. He is saying the reward is too great. The risk, I feel, is not really high enough to justify me foregoing the reward, ergo, I'm going to seek after the reward. So that's what we're seeing play out in front of us right now. He seems to be one of the very early adopters of that, but, you know, we'll see whether or not that comes to fruition and becomes a bigger deal later on. Now, another one that was really, really bothersome to me the other day, a story that I saw coming out of Montgomery, is that the Montgomery Police Department essentially wants to make its citizens the secret police. So that really kind of bothered me. The MPD has specifically asked for people to use the Crime Stoppers line if they see anybody in violation of the stay-at-home orders, which it really, really bothers me, this idea. And by the way, this is the same thing that happened with the churches with Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, where he's saying that the citizens should be keeping an eye out for worship services, and if they see anybody worshiping, they need to tell us so that we can go in and take care of it. This idea that the government is asking its citizens to essentially become ad hoc law enforcement, that's not a good idea for a couple of reasons, but I think the one that is most important is that it seems to pit us against one another. Like, if you're asking citizens to specifically just be patrolling around on the lookout for people who are disobeying these laws or something to that effect, like, it's one thing if you see a guy breaking into somebody else's house. Yes, when that happens, you should definitely notify somebody in authority. But when you notice somebody breaking a stay-at-home order, first of all, there's really not a moral quality to that. Whether you agree with it or not, you can't say that it is immoral to go out and want to play catch in the park with your kid. And secondly, not only is there not really a moral quality to it, but even though you could make the argument that it's a law, and I'd say that you could argue the constitutionality of it, but even if you're ignoring that, it's still something that it's a little different than something that is actually endangering somebody. For example, if I saw somebody driving recklessly, like straight up about to kill somebody on the road, and I have done this before, if I think that they may be drunk or something like that, I'm going to call an authority figure. If I see somebody going 5 miles over the speed limit, but they're driving safely, well, that's not really my business. And I think the problem is that because so many of us are in panic mode, we see doing everyday activities as somebody that's swerving all over the road and driving recklessly. And I don't think that's a healthy place to be. I mean, I don't want to go out. I want to abide by the rules as much as possible. Like I said, I've been quarantined myself for over a month. I started earlier than people were telling me to. I started before the stay-at-home orders came down. Significantly before, actually. So I take this stuff seriously. But at the same time, I don't want people to feel like their neighbors are going to rat them out whenever they step a toe out of line. And with this stuff, you could make the argument it's not even a real law. So it's a really bad look, and I think that it sets up a lot of discord and discontentment between your neighbors, which are the people that we should be getting to know, and we should be relying on more in a time of crisis, not less. And the thing is, this is typically how you get the really ridiculous arrest, the ones that we've seen online, the ones that we've read stories about, like in California where the guy was paddleboarding out in the ocean by himself. I don't know, maybe a citizen called him in. I'm not sure about that. Maybe it was just the authorities happened to see him. But like the dad playing ball in the park with his daughter, just playing catch with her, away from everybody else, to use his own words, 6 feet, we were at least 16 feet away from everybody else at all times. And that guy gets arrested in front of his daughter for that. You can rest assured that what happened is some busybody went out and saw that that was taking place and called the cops. See, implementing strategies like this, especially with citizens that don't have discernment and police officers that are obligated by law to check out a citizen complaint if they are indeed in violation of something like this, that's how you get those ridiculous arrests. And I don't want to see that. Not in my community. I don't want to see it anywhere, but especially not in my community. So I thought the best way to explain this with an analogy was to do so in a way that each generation would understand it, because I thought there's a couple of these that somebody in a certain generation wouldn't get. So here we go. If you're a millennial or a Gen Z, the best way to explain this story is they're trying to turn us all into Karens. They're trying to go out and make us all into little busybodies that are all up in everybody else's business and basically the town gossip. That's what they're trying to turn us into. And I don't like it. Don't be a Karen. It's a bad idea. And I hate that that's the expression that has cropped up in my generation, because I actually really like the name Karen. I think it's a beautiful name. But nonetheless, you know what I'm talking about when you say, don't be a Karen. With Gen Z and boomers. Sorry, not Gen Z. Gen X and boomers. So if you're in my parents' or my grandparents' generation, they're trying to turn us all into Gladys Kravitz. You may remember Gladys Kravitz, the kooky neighbor from Bewitched that couldn't mind her own business, was constantly looking out the window, seeing if somebody was doing something. That's who they're trying to turn us into if you're a Gen X or a boomer. And if you are a silent generation or a greatest generation person, then this one's going to be real easy. The MPD is trying to turn us all into the Gestapo. The German secret police! So the people that aren't in police uniforms that are just roaming around in street clothes trying to catch people doing something. Now, my friend, Laura Clark, who is a wonderful, intelligent friend of mine, I think that she was wrong in doing this, but she made an excellent point. Which is, after I posted this exact same analogy, she said, I think it's overplaying it a little bit to compare people looking out for those who might be violating the stay-at-home orders and comparing them to the Nazis. Okay, here's the thing. I think that she is technically wrong, but if you're looking at the connotation of what she's talking about, Laura Clark, my former co-host, who I deeply respect, is kind of right. It's the only thing I could think of for Silent Generation and Greatest Generation people that they might get it. But, you know, as a general rule, and this is one that I usually abide by, it's not a great idea to compare people to Nazis, no matter how bad their policies are. I'm not saying that the MPD wants to round up Jews and cook them in an oven. That is not what I'm suggesting. In the same sense that when I say, well, you know, Hitler was a vegetarian, I'm not suggesting that all vegetarians hate Jews. What I am suggesting is that they are similar to Nazis in this one very specific way. And I don't even think that's necessarily a socialist or a national socialist, to be more specific, thing. I think it's more of a big government thing. Because you look in George Orwell's classic novel 1984, that's exactly what was going on there, where the government basically silently conscripted, why can I not talk today? Basically silently urged the public to, if you see something, say something. That's a big government mindset, that you want the individual citizens just finding everybody that's making a nuisance of themselves or finding everybody that's committing a crime and nailing them. There's a time and place for that. Like I said, if you see somebody breaking into somebody's house or somebody trying to stab someone, yes, call the cops. But the idea that every little thing is something that the average citizen should be walking around, and you want the entire society to be A, suspicious of their neighbors, and B, having to walk on pins and needles to ensure that they don't break one of the thousands of these different little violations, these little things that you could get in trouble for violating the stay-at-home order, that is not good for society. And it's one of the reasons that in Nazi Germany that people were so incredibly distrustful of everybody else, because they didn't know who might be a German secret police. And even if they never ran into a Gestapo, they had to basically assume that they were surrounded by cops everywhere they were. That's not something that builds a good or free society. So I agree with Laura's assessment that me using Nazi symbolism to make my point, probably unwise, but it was the only thing that I could think of that really makes the point. But I also wanted to clarify that the MPD are not Nazis, nor are the people walking around that are being Karens and reporting every little thing that they see because they've got nothing better to do stuck in their house than to watch the neighbors and see if they're complying with the stay-at-home orders. I mean, yes, that's obnoxious, but they're not Nazis. I'm just saying that's the closest thing that I could think of that people in that generation would understand. So, good debate tip from Laura. I commend her for that. I don't think that I was out of line in doing that. But nonetheless, I'll leave that up to you and your opinion. Now, one other big story that we have out of the state of Alabama, and I really wanted to bring this up, via WVNN, which is another one of our sister stations up in Huntsville, the Alabama Cattlemen's Association, a organization that I have been affiliated with since I may have even been 12 or 11, but definitely since I've been a teenager, and have done countless events for them. The Alabama Cattlemen's Association, Vice President Erin Beasley, said today in an interview, Quote, our producers here in Alabama are really the beginning of the chain, talking about the supply chain when it comes to beef. They're what we call cow-calf producers, so they have herds of mama cows, and then they produce a calf each year. And that calf is going to be sold when he gets a certain weight, anywhere from 500 to 800 pounds. And that animal is then going to make its way through the growth process, probably stopping at what we call stock operator, which utilizes a lot of grass to put weight on these animals, then ultimately at the feedlot, where we finish the cattle before they go to the processing plant. The whole cycle takes anywhere from 14 to 20 months, but we are at the beginning of the food chain. We don't have a shortage of beef in this country, Beasley added. Flat out, there is no shortage. Now, this is fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all, this is all stuff that I know, but it's things that if you're in the cattle business and you know people that are not, you kind of forget the fact that they don't really understand that there's a whole bunch of moving parts to this thing, and the cattle don't even stay with the same owner most of the time throughout the growth process. You do have, like she was talking about, you have people that actually birth the cattle and take care of the mama cows, and then that steer or heifer, depending on what gender it is, moves on to be grazed, and then it moves on eventually to the feedlot, and then you have of course slaughter and then transportation. Because of that, what she's really speaking to is people are saying, well, I don't understand. Why is there not beef at the grocery store? Why is it not at the market? There's two reasons that is going on. First of all, there have been interruptions in the supply chain. Not really interruptions in the production side of it, because all the steps that we just talked about, the 3 steps that lead up until slaughter, there haven't really been any hiccups in, at least not to a large scale, anywhere either in Alabama or the United States of America. There is not a beef shortage. The issue is that there are hiccups within the supply chain, and so moving those cattle from one place to the other, whether it be before slaughter or after slaughter, may be experiencing some hiccups, but there's not a shortage of the cattle themselves. The amount of cattle remained roughly the same. And so you've got supply chain issues, and that's one thing you have to understand about modern economics, is that there was a time that existed for the vast majority of human history where if there was a food shortage, pretty much the entire time, you were dealing with a production shortage. So if there was just less corn one year and the price of corn was more expensive and it was harder to find corn, it wasn't because there were issues with the production. It wasn't because there were issues transporting corn from one place to another. 9 times out of 10, it was because they just had a bad yield that year. The corn producers just didn't produce as much as they normally did. We have gotten so incredibly good and efficient when it comes to American agriculture that even in bad years, we barely even notice a blip in the market. Our production has become incredibly consistent, especially when you compare it to the rest of human history. And so now what normally happens is if there are food shortages or really shortages of any resource of any kind in the United States or anywhere else, but especially in the United States, normally the reason for that is not because of a lack of production, nor is it something like having a bad year, not getting enough rain, something like that. Normally, it's a supply chain issue. And I think that really is a testament to how we have advanced as a society and what the free market has done for agriculture. When you look at that, the vast majority of food shortages, the vast majority of hunger usually is an issue with something in the supply chain, whether it's government mismanagement or whatever you want to call it. The fact that mismanagement or a poor allocation of resources is the problem, not a lack of resources themselves, man, that's such a good problem to have. But it does speak to the fact that people need to understand that these shortages are not caused by the producers. The shortages are caused by either issues in the supply chain because of the virus, or, and this is the more common issue, it's actually caused by the consumers themselves. The fact that people are trying to buy up pounds and pounds and pounds of ground beef or steak or whatever else it is, and it's creating shortages because they're scared and panic buying and don't know when they'll be able to get the next one. And there is a rapid increase in demand, despite the fact that people are not really eating more or less beef than they used to, is part of the problem. Another big issue with the problem is where we are eating. Because the supply chain is incredibly efficient, like I just laid out. The important thing to understand with that, though, is it has gotten efficient at going where it's supposed to go. Remember, even though it seems like an eternity if you've been quarantined, and I can speak to this, I haven't left my apartment in 30 days. When you have gotten so efficient and so used to sending your supply to a certain place, then it's hard to pick up those very efficient, ingrained supply chains and move them somewhere else. People are probably eating about the same amount of beef now that they were before the quarantine started up. What's the difference? Well, I don't know about you, but the average person was probably eating some beef at home, probably cooking pasta for their family, and probably occasionally making a pot roast or a steak. And then 2, maybe 3 times a week, they were going out to eat, getting a steak sandwich at Logan's or at Longhorn's or at McDonald's. And practically, not all, but practically all of that demand has dried up because people aren't going out to eat. And even the ones that are getting takeout and to-go orders, they're not doing so at the same rate that they were going to restaurants, at least for the vast majority of the population. And so that's the other side of this. People are panic buying and depleting the current reserves, so they have a lot more beef than they need, and that means that other people don't have as much as they want. And then the other side of that is they're having to redirect a whole bunch of supply chains to move beef to supermarkets as opposed to restaurants. And given enough time, we will catch up on that. We will start getting the meat to where it needs to go, but just like any other system, it does take a little time to adjust. Now, it's far better than a government-run system where it doesn't operate nearly as efficiently, and usually those changes and redirections take a lot longer to get there. But even though the free market does take a little time to adjust, we have to all be aware of that fact in order to really understand what's going on here. Now, I want to say this, sort of as a closing thought before we move on to the next segment of the show. Can we just take a minute to acknowledge how incredibly cool it is that we are looking at some of the members of society that we probably haven't appreciated nearly as much as we should as heroes right now? Because personally, I love that. We just got done talking about farmers and ranchers and some of the things that they do that we, like, all 50 states looked at farmers and ranchers and said, yep, that's essential. And I think that that's obvious, and anybody that would have asked that, hey, the people that grow our food, essential or non-essential? I'm going to go with essential. Like, it's a no-brainer, but the fact that it's being put front and center, I think is a fantastic thing for our society and a fantastic thing for us. And I'm hoping what it does is, especially people that are kind of cut off from that agrarian society, that they think their food comes from the supermarket, or at least that's how it plays out in their head as opposed to being grown by people. I think the fact that the supply chain does get a little bit interrupted might give them a real appreciation for people like our farmers and our ranchers that are out there growing the food every single day, putting food on America's tables. That's something that I think may be a big silver lining that comes out of this. Obviously, I'd rather it not happen that way. I'd rather this thing not be an issue. But if this is going to happen, that may be a really big silver lining to where people go, huh, so I guess the ground beef doesn't just show up at my grocery store. There are people actually involved in getting it there. It makes people think. It puts it at the forefront of their brain instead of it being an afterthought. I think that's a good thing. And I also think it's really cool that we're acknowledging some other people in our society that are doing amazing work right now. I mean, look at our doctors and nurses and the way that we're applauding them and trying to, I don't know how many people I've seen on social media go like, hey, just so you know, because I have a lot of friends that are nurses. I'm a cancer patient. I don't know how many people I have seen just go, hey, I just want you to know that I'm praying for you. They're sending cards. They're saying, hey, if there's anything I can do to help out, bring you some food. There's been such an outpouring of love and affection towards our medical staff, our doctors and nurses. That's a really good thing. And you know who else I've seen people talking about? Grocers and people that are in charge of, I mean, even stock boys that really never get any kind of appreciation. The people that are making sure that the shelves are stocked, that are working overtime to make sure that people have a place to come where they can get food and get essentials. We're looking at those people as heroes and really should. And another one that's near and dear to my heart, truckers. Not only are truckers sort of the lifeblood of the conservative talk radio stream, which obviously is important to me for very obvious reasons. Also, I have truckers in my family, specifically my grandfather, who just celebrated his 70th birthday. And Papa, despite the fact that he's 70 and inside that window where he's at high risk, now he's taking precautions. He wears a mask. When he fills up or has to go out to deliver a package or anything, he's wearing gloves, he's sanitizing things, so he's being extra cautious. But think about this, a guy that is by definition in the high-risk area for this virus, and I'm sure that there's millions of other truckers out there doing exactly the same thing that are also at risk. They're like, you know what, it's important that I get out and do this because there are people that are relying on me. And he drives different things around the country. It changes. Usually he drives for Buffalo Rock. So, just beverages, but still, like the fact that we've got truckers out there making sure that our supply lines are working, making sure that people are getting food, they are really an unsung American hero. And I appreciate the work that they do, not just because my grandfather is one, because I was the same way before he became a trucker. But, I mean, God bless our truckers. And I personally feel a lot safer knowing that they're out there trying to make sure that people are getting the things that they need. And another thing, which is another one that I have a family tie into, teachers. I think because so many parents are having to homeschool their kids for the first time and looking at the material they have to go over and the work that they have to do, and I have some teacher friends that are talking to me about this, and my dad is a teacher, but of course he's retired, so he's not going through this. But I have a lot of teacher friends that are telling me, I'm getting so many letters, I'm getting thank you cards, I'm getting people call me up and they'll ask me questions about things, but at the end of the call, they'll just stop for a second and say, by the way, I really appreciate what you do. This is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. So I really like the fact that we're really applauding teachers and acknowledging all the really hard work that they do throughout the year. They may not be working right now, but there are a lot of teachers that are even going above and beyond and having tutoring sessions with people virtually to do their job. And so farmers, ranchers, doctors, nurses, grocers, truckers, teachers, utility workers. That's another one, especially in Alabama where we just recently had a whole bunch of people in the state with power outages, going out there making sure, because guys, how bad would this suck without Netflix? Really? Like being stuck in your house all day, no Netflix, no Hulu. I actually don't even have Netflix anymore. I use Hulu and Disney Plus. But all our streaming services and the power. I remember when the power went out over here and I was like, oh gosh, this is going to suck if I'm stuck here for a couple days with no power. But, thank God for those people. And I like the fact that we are looking at normal working class Americans and applauding them as heroes. I think that's a practice that we should continue to do long after we're all out and resuming our normal lives. Because ultimately, I think for a long time in this country, we did look at those people as heroes, and we've kind of lost that a little bit. And I'd just like to say thank you to all of those people in those professions and some of the other ones that I'm sure I missed when it comes to essential workers. I thank you, and America thanks you. We appreciate what you do. And I think that when it comes to some of those professions, it would all do us a world of good to just remember to appreciate them and appreciate all the people that serve us kind of behind the scenes that we don't always necessarily know about or look at. You people make a difference. Your work is appreciated. And I think right now, this is a really good opportunity for America to acknowledge that. And I think that in a lot of ways they have, at least from what I've seen. And I hope that we don't forget that when we're all outside and resuming life as normal. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a quick break here, and we'll be back in just a minute on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible, with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible read by Pete Buttigieg. Today's reading is going to come from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 30 through 38. And it says, Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, who were probably only stealing because the capitalist system had trapped them in a life of poverty. And they stripped him and beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him. And when he saw him, he felt socially conscious outrage, and came to him and went on a passionate social media rant about how wrong it was that the priest and the Levite had ignored him, and how it proves that traditional organized religion doesn't work. When the man asked him for help, the Samaritan explained how the Jews had been systematically oppressing the Samaritans for centuries, and that he didn't need his help because of his Jew privilege. But despite this, the Samaritan assured him he would be the bigger man and contact his senator in Rome and start a new government program to help victims of roadside robberies and fund it by raising taxes on the 1%. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, the one who taught him to be woke and fought the system with redistribution of wealth instead of just helping that one guy. Then Jesus said to him, go and do the same, comrade. Wow. So inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics. We are going to go to the Daily Dose of Stupid here in just a second, but I wanted to say something before we get to that. Today is actually my little brother's birthday, so happy birthday, Levi. I appreciate everything that you do, and Lord knows I have not been an ideal big brother, especially when we were younger, and I don't mind sharing this on the air. I know that this is going to be hard to believe, especially considering the fans that I have that know how I feel about personal property rights. I was a pretty selfish older brother, especially when my little brother, who is 8 years younger than me, always wanted to play with my stuff. I was definitely not the ideal big brother, but, you know, working through that and learning about how your actions make other people feel, I think that is really one of the greatest lessons you can learn from being an older sibling. Because there's so many things in life that you do, whether it's being a parent or being a spouse, neither of which I've done before, that teach you to not always think about yourself. But I think really one of the lessons that teaches that the best, I'm not saying it's the same as having a kid or anything, because you don't have nearly that level of responsibility. But one thing that really does teach responsibility at a very early age is having younger siblings. And when it comes to my brother, that's a lesson that I had to learn through experience, and I think I'm a better person because of that. I mean, having to learn and to grow and to remember that I'm responsible for taking care of people, that I have a obligation to make sure that my little brother and little sister are doing okay, that I have a obligation to protect them, to do what's best for them, to look out for them. I think that's something that, especially since I'm probably never going to be a dad, that just because, you know, that's not a choice that I'm willing to make, at least not at this point in my life. I think that probably more than anything else in my life really taught me how to think about other people and how to worry about what they want and what they need. And I'm really grateful for that lesson. And when it comes to Levi, I mean, he's definitely the smartest of the three of us, and also somebody that I look up to and admire. And I'd like to think that I had a mostly good influence on him. But, you know, you always hope that that's the case, but either way, I'm really glad that you're around. I appreciate that we celebrate the day that you came into our lives. So happy birthday, Levi. Thank you so much for being who you are. Now, I did want to go ahead and jump to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And today's Daily Dose of Stupid, I'm sure that you've heard about this before, so I'm not going to harp on a lot of the details, but you may have heard the other day that President Trump made what, in my mind, was a dumb move, but I'm going to explain that there is some nuance in it and something that people should understand. I'm more knocking the stupidity of what it looks like than what it actually is. So, President Trump threatened to adjourn Congress yesterday. This is something that in the entire 240 plus year of us having a president, 230 plus years of us having a president, having a Congress, this is a power, a check and balance that has never actually been used at any point. And so essentially what it revolves around is that if the Congress is not meeting, if the Congress is not in session, if they are in a recess, the president has constitutional power to adjourn Congress, and that would also give him the ability to make what are known as recess appointments. In other words, he would be able to appoint judges to the federal circuit without them having to be confirmed through the Senate because the Senate would not be meeting. So here's really where I come down on this one. This is one of those stories where there's a lot of stupid to go around. Like, it's not just President Trump. There's a lot of stupid on every side of this, even though he's kind of feuding with the members of Congress. I think that there's a lot of stupidity going on in Congress right now, too. I know that that's not exactly a groundbreaking declaration, but nonetheless, it is something that I believe. So it's a thing where Trump is well within his constitutional rights to do so. If you're asking me as a constitutional matter, hey, can Trump actually do this? I would say, yeah. Yep, Trump can absolutely do that. Well, what if Trump is saying that the reason that he's doing it is to get recess appointments through? No, it doesn't matter. Trump can still do it. I know a lot of people are not going to like that answer, but just understanding the Constitution as I do and the way that I read it, I don't see how anybody could make the argument that Trump doing that would be unconstitutional regardless of what his motivation is. Now, I wish his motivation were something different, but even if it weren't, like if he's just doing this as a strategy to go ahead and get his federal nominations through, I think that it looks really bad, but he's well within his rights to do it. And so this is one of those stories that I'm not questioning the intelligence of the decision when it comes to can I do it? I'm questioning the intelligence of the decision of should I do it? Those are two very different things most of the time. So the way that President Trump came out with this and the way that he phrased it, the way he said it, I'm sure I'm getting some media spin on it, and that's fair. But it's also fair to acknowledge that, yeah, they're spinning it some, but that's really what he meant. I don't think that any intelligent person that has been following President Trump doubts the fact that, yes, he was saying that that was his motivation, and that's what he actually meant by saying it. Now, I say this as a person who thinks that one of the few really bright spots that I have very little complaints with President Trump is with his appointment of justices. I think that Brett Kavanaugh was not a fantastic choice, but I think that it was certainly better than some of the choices that he could make, and we'll see where Brett Kavanaugh falls when it comes to that. So, you know, I have no problem with Trump wanting to get his federal nominations through. I don't. I think that that's overall a positive thing. But this is not the right way to do it. Even if you have the power to do it, I think that there are smarter ways to do it, especially when you would be using a method that literally no president from George Washington all the way up to President Trump, none of the other 44 have ever done it. And I think that it would be really intelligent for him, even if that were secretly his motivation, for him not to say that. His point of frustration is not unfounded, though. Because the point that he was making the other day, look, you guys do your jobs and actually vote on these people. Now is not the time to have that fight, though. I think that Congress, especially if they're going to be asking certain parts of the American population. We just did a segment right before the break talking about how we're looking up to, I think, legitimate American heroes when it comes to people that are keeping our groceries on the shelves, people that are farming, people that are teachers that are helping their students out even though school's not in session anymore, doctors, nurses. We're looking at all of those people and saying, no, you have to work. Teachers are a bit of an exception in that category, but they're saying, no, it's okay for you little people, you peons out there in flyover country. It's all right for you guys to go out and do some work and keep the economy at least somewhat running and keeping our society going, but not us. I mean, we have more important things to do, and it's just not safe for us to congregate together. I remember when Thomas Massey called for a quorum vote, which, by the way, he did so with like 3 days' notice, so it's not like he did it at the last minute anyway. But their argument was, oh, well, we can't do that. It's unsafe for the members of the House to come together. I was like, but it's safe for the truckers, and it's safe for our utility workers, and it's safe for basically every other job that we've deemed essential. It's just the little people that, it's okay if they go out and risk getting the coronavirus. You people up in Washington, you elites, you're the ones that are worried that you might catch it, which is a legitimate concern, and they should be cautious about it. But ultimately, it's a really bad look for Congress to say, no, you people can go out and work. We've got to stay safe. Yeah, gag me with that sentiment. So, ultimately, this is a lot of stupid on every end. It's really dumb for Trump to say this, and because what it looks like to the average voter, especially one that's not following all these things all that closely, they're looking at it and going, oh, see, Trump, what he's doing here is he's trying to flex his authoritative muscle and use this crisis as an excuse to just go ahead and get the judges that he wants through. That's not really an entirely accurate way to categorize it, and the reason that I say that is because the majority in the Senate is Republican. And so he probably would have gotten those appointments anyway. It's not as though Congress it's not as though Congress meeting would mean that he would get all those federal judges turned down. So the idea that he's trying to slip something past the goalie, that's not really accurate. If there were a Democrat majority in the Senate, yeah, probably that's a fair assessment. But the fact that the vast majority of President Trump's federal judge picks have gone through anyway is kind of indicative of the fact that he wouldn't be getting different judges whether he made recess appointments or he was appointing them and they went through the congressional approval process. I don't see this as a thing that President Trump is saying because he wants some judges that he knows wouldn't pass the muster in Congress and to be able to get them confirmed through the Senate. It's more like he's upset that it's not happening and he wants to get those judges through, and he knows that they're going to approve pretty much all of his federal judges anyway, so he just wants to expedite that process since they're not doing it right now, which is not an unfair thing to want. And so, even though I think that he's correct in that, you have to understand that to the average voter, this looks real bad. It looks as though President Trump is trying to seize on presidential authority and increase his own political influence and power, and using the coronavirus to do so. The fact that he's whining about this is kind of like celebrities whining about being confined in a giant mansion with 3 swimming pools. It's kind of the same look. You see what I'm saying? It's not that the complaint is completely unfounded. It's more that we just don't want to hear it right now. And so I think that there's a bit of a timing issue and an optics issue when it comes to what President Trump is actually doing. But on Congress's side, look, either do your freaking jobs or just go ahead and call recess. Go ahead and adjourn the Congress yourself. This is not a hard thing to do. Now, personally, I don't have a problem with Congress being out of session. I don't have a problem with Congress being out of session for pretty much the entirety of the year. I would be fine with that. Remember, there was a time where Congress really only met for like 3 weeks out of the year. And so I'd be perfectly fine with them going ahead and adjourning, and especially since they know that if Trump does make any recess appointments, they're probably ones that he would have gotten confirmed anyway. There's not much chance that the Republican-controlled Senate would have not confirmed them. So Congress needs to step up. Congress needs to either call themselves an adjourn, or they need to figure out a way to approve it either way. So there's really wrong on both sides here. I just hate the fact that the American public is probably going to read this story completely wrong because they have a lack of understanding of how these things normally operate. Congress, if you want to be out of session, that's your business. But quit with this straddling the fence garbage. Either be in session and actually conduct business, or don't be in session. But don't just hold these 1 minute long meetings and say that we're technically still in session now. No, either declare a recess or adjourn and let the president go ahead and make recess appointments, or don't. But this in-between crap isn't really helping anybody. Let's go to the chaplain's report. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our chaplain's report today does come from the book of 1 Samuel. And this really makes sense if you understand, and I'm sure if you're watching this, you probably already do, that Israel has really had a very hard time with idolatry since the very beginning. When God brings them out as a nation from Egypt, the very first thing that they do, right after seeing all 10 plagues, right after walking across the Red Sea on dry land and watching God destroy Pharaoh's army, and right after Moses ascends up to Sinai and they see the presence of God in the distance, the mountain smoking and the cloud covering it, all of that, first thing they do, build an idol just like they had in Egypt. That had to be just so infuriating for God, and we see the outcome of that in the scripture. And even before then, we see people connected to the patriarchs kind of waffling on that, like Rachel, when it comes to trying to carry other gods with her other than the one true God. And so this has been a struggle for the Israelite people since the very beginning. And they keep trying to flirt with this sin. It's sort of the pet sin of Israel throughout most of the Old Testament history. And so if you understand that, a lot of this makes a lot more sense. And you also need to understand that throughout the Judges, and especially the time period in the first few chapters of Samuel, the big rivals for the children of Israel have been a group of pagans known as the Philistines. That's the nation that seems to give them the most trouble when it comes to this particular section of the Bible. So this has been their big rival since all of this started, and they've been fighting back and forth, and the Philistines have taken a lot of Israel's cities. We actually saw, and we went over a few days ago, the Philistines actually at one point take the Ark of the Covenant, and they take it away from Israel and try to put it into their temple. That doesn't work out so well for them, but the point is they're still at this war with the Philistines, and the Philistines are still having a lot of success against Israel on the battlefield. So they're calling to Samuel. They ask him for help, and they ask him for advice on what they should do. This is his response in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 3 through 4, where he says, "Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, If you return to the Lord with all your heart, remove the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and direct your hearts to the Lord, and serve him alone, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines." So the sons of Israel removed the Baals and the Ashtaroth and served the Lord alone. Now, this is about as strong a statement as it makes anywhere in the Old Testament. There are another that are about equally as strong, but the indication given here, especially if you're looking at the whole of the Old Testament in context, this is one of the very few times where a prophet told Israel to do something and to get rid of these other gods, and they actually listened. They heard what he said, and there is not even a hint of rebellion. I'm sure that not every single Israelite did this, but the implication that is given from the scripture here is that for the most part, at this small, specific time during Israel's history, Samuel said, you want to get rid of the Philistines? You really want to be delivered out of their hand? Get rid of these other gods. Get them out of your life. And when you do that, God will deliver you by his hand from the Philistines. And it's a pretty simple request. But considering the fact that throughout the majority of Israel's history, and from this point forward in the scripture, we'll see them essentially do exactly the same thing. When God tells them to get rid of these idols, they typically don't. For whatever reason, Israel's heart seems to always drift back to idolatry. And really up until the intertestamental period, that 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and New Testament, that really seems to be the first time that Israel finally gets the message, and for an extended period of time gets these idols out of their life and serves only God. It's one of those things that's really simple, but Israel seemed to have a pretty big struggle with, despite the fact that it was a fairly simple request. And we'll see how this plays out. We'll see sort of the conclusion and what happens as a result of this in 1 Samuel 7:12 through 14. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shin and named it Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not come any more within the border of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron even to Gath, and Israel delivered their territory from the hand of the Philistines, so there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Now, I want to point out a couple things. First of all, that's a pretty good end to the story. God said, you do this, I will deliver you from the Philistines' hand. And for once in their history, Israel actually looks at that and goes, yeah, we can do that. And they actually do it. They actually get rid of all the Baals and the Astaroths and all these other pagan idols from their life. And then God does exactly what he says he would do. All the cities of Israel that had been taken by the Philistines, those get restored back to him. All these issues that they've been having with Philistine raiders, God allows them to prosper against the Philistines. When they go out into battle against them, God protects them, and they wind up winning those battles and driving them back. And these attacks by the Philistines are not something that they have to deal with to the level that they had beforehand. They're able to have some success. They're able to have some victory. But I want to draw your attention to the latter part of verse 13, and I'll go ahead and pull that back up here. If you look at there in the last part of 13, it does say that the Philistines were subdued, but you'll also notice that and the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Well, now hang on. They're subdued, but they're not destroyed. And they're there, but they're not coming through the border of Israel. And it also says the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Now, what does that imply? That the Philistines, they didn't just go away. They were still there. And if the Lord's hand was against the Philistines all the days that Samuel was there, that also implies that, yeah, God was against them and God protected Israel, but they were still attacking Israel. I think there's a really powerful lesson to be drawn from that yes, God did deliver them, but he didn't eliminate the problem. I think that we make a mistake a lot of days as modern Christians, that we want to pray for God to take a problem away completely, that we want him to just fix the problem. And normally God's help doesn't come in that form. Normally what happens is God gives us some kind of boon or some ability to overcome it. He gives us some kind of opportunity to deal with it ourselves. He very rarely just eliminates a problem outright. And that seems to be the same thing that is happening here. Now, God allowed Israel to triumph over the Philistines where he had not done so previously. He did give the children of Israel a certain ability to defeat them, and he also did so effectively that it says that he restored their cities to them, that the Philistines did not even cross the borders of Israel. But the point is, they were still there. They were still an ever-present threat. And to us, especially after God promised that he would deliver them from the Philistines, that might almost seem a little bit unfair. Like, hey, what gives? God said that if we did all this, that he would keep his end of the bargain and deliver us. Well, he did deliver them, but he didn't eliminate the Philistines as a result. And that's the thing I think that we need to understand. That when we pray for God to do something for us, or we are really struggling with something, whether it be another person, whether it be some kind of temptation that we're dealing with, whether it be a bad situation that we're in, regardless of what it is, we shouldn't be praying for God to just get rid of the problem altogether most of the time. I mean, I guess it's okay to pray for that, but that's not the answer that we should really be looking for. Instead of praying for a lighter load, most of the time what we should be praying for is a stronger back. That when we pray to God to deliver us from a situation, we need to recognize that that doesn't always necessarily mean just getting rid of the problem for us. Normally what it means is that God gives us a way to overcome that obstacle. God didn't eliminate the Philistines. And you know what? He helped them prosper in battle, but they still had to go fight. Samuel brought the Ebenezer, the stone of help, sort of as a symbol to rally the troops and let them know that God was with them and that God was going to assist them in battle, and he did so to spectacular fashion. But that didn't mean that Israel didn't have to go and fight the battle. I think a lot of times modern Christians make the mistake of assuming that because Jesus Christ came and died for our sins and sacrificed, and all the work of getting rid of our sin and forgiving it is done, that almost means that works are unimportant or we don't have to do anything. Well, we don't have to do anything to earn our salvation. That's completely against what the Bible teaches. But that also doesn't imply that we're not supposed to be working and doing what God asks us to do. Just like Israel, God promises you're going to prosper. You are going to beat the Philistines if you do these things, if you do what I ask you, if you are obedient to my voice. I am going to help you overcome your enemies. That doesn't mean you sit back in a lawn chair and wait for your enemies to be destroyed. You still have to go out and fight. So, yes, God is putting forth an effort. And I would even suggest, based on the scripture and based on the reading of it, that God is putting out a majority of the effort because the children of Israel did not prosper against the Philistines when they tried to do it on their own terms and by their own merit and by their own power. So nothing the children of Israel did was going to work without God behind them, but that didn't absolve them from the responsibility to show up and fight the battle as well. God did his part. He gave them the assistance that he promised them, but he also expected them to go out and fight that battle. And God expects us to do the exact same thing. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalreda Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.